Ever wonder how fear was weaponized in the Middle Ages? Not just with swords or fire, but with cold, silent machines built to make people confess to things they never even did. Yeah, this is one of those stories. They say the Iron Maiden never screamed, but his victims did, loudly. Let's talk about the world's most terrifying closet. Alright, here's the thing. If you've ever seen a spiked coffin-looking thing in a horror movie, or maybe on the cover of a metal album, chances are that's the Iron Maiden. And you probably thought, no way that was real. That had to be some Hollywood invention. Right? Wrong. Maybe. This video is a deep dive into one of the most infamous torture devices in human history. But not just the device itself. We're going to walk straight into the dungeon, smell the damp stone, feel the chill of iron against your neck, and dig into the stories, real and imagined, of how people used fear, pain, and lies to hold on to power. We're covering who invented the Iron Maiden and whether it even existed when people say it did, how it was supposedly used, and who got thrown into it, the chilling psychology behind its design, because this thing wasn't just about pain, it was about mind games, what it says about how we remember the Middle Ages, and maybe even how we invent monsters to deal with our own history. And yeah, we'll also settle the big question. Was the Iron Maiden actually real, or just a creepy museum hoax that got way out of hand? Don't blink. We're going way, way down the rabbit hole. Let's start at the beginning. Not with the Iron Maiden, actually, but with pain. See, torture has been around pretty much forever. Long before medieval Europe, ancient civilizations already had creative ways of making people suffer. The Assyrians used impalement. The Romans had crucifixion. The Greeks liked to use the brazen bull, a hollow brass statue you'd get roasted alive inside, your screams echoing through tubes so it sounded like a bull bellowing. Yeah, people have been awful for a long time. But the Middle Ages, that era turned pain into policy. In medieval Europe, think roughly 500 to 1500 AD, torture was basically part of the legal system, like officially. If someone was accused of a crime and there wasn't enough proof, the authorities could say, well, let's ask God. And by ask God, they meant, let's put this guy through something so awful that if he's innocent, surely God will protect him. They called this trial by ordeal. Not subtle. You might be made to carry hot iron, plunge your arm into boiling water, or get thrown into a river. Sink, and you were innocent. Float, and, well, clearly you were in league with the devil. Burn her. Now, here's where things get interesting, because that whole medieval torture craze, it didn't start with the Iron Maiden. That came later, maybe much later. First, we need to meet some of the Iron Maiden's earlier cousins. One of the big names in medieval pain was the rack. You've probably heard of it. Big wooden frame, ropes on your wrists and ankles. Then they'd turn a crank and slowly stretch you. Joints pop, ligaments snap. Eventually, your shoulders, hips, and knees would dislocate. The goal wasn't always to kill you, just break you enough that you'd confess. Then there was the strappado. Sounds fancy, right? Nope. They'd tie your hands behind your back, hoist you up by a rope, and then drop you. Not all the way. Just enough to yank your shoulders out of their sockets. Clean, simple, and extremely effective. But those were tools of the Inquisition. Especially the Spanish Inquisition, which, yeah, nobody expected. Religious authorities across Europe had the legal power to use torture on accused heretics, and they used it often. Still, for all the damage those devices caused, there was something missing. Theatrics, fear, the psychological horror. And that's where the Iron Maiden earns its crown. Let's paint the picture. You're in a stone room. The air's damp, smells like mold and blood. There's a huge, upright metal cabinet in front of you. At first, it just looks like a coffin. Tall, closed, hinged. Then they open it. Inside, lining both doors, are iron spikes, sharp, long, cold. Some are aimed at your chest, others your face. A few, disturbingly, are just off-center, not meant to kill you immediately, but to pierce the soft parts, under your ribs, around your eyes, between your legs. It's not meant to kill you fast. It's meant to make you feel every inch of metal as it closes. You don't scream at first, you just freeze. And that's the genius, or the cruelty, of the Iron Maiden. It's not just a device, it's a message. It says, this is what happens to people who talk back. It's not about truth, it's about obedience. But who built it? Here's the twist. The Iron Maiden might not be medieval at all. The first time an Iron Maiden showed up, like actually showed up as a physical object anyone could see, was in 1793. Not 1293, not even 1493. Try the 18th century in Germany. The city was Nuremberg. And yeah, it was a wild time. A guy named Johann Philipp Siebenkees, a professor, philosopher, and part-time historical drama king, claimed that an Iron Maiden had been discovered and that it had been used back in 1515 to execute a coin forger. Yes, a coin forger. He described it in detail, saying it was lined with spikes and used to slowly kill its victim over days. People ate it up. The story spread fast. The problem? There's zero evidence it ever happened. No one before Siebenkees ever wrote about an Iron Maiden. No medieval drawings, no court records, nothing. And this guy, he was kind of known for getting dramatic with history. Fast forward to the 1800s. Museums started popping up all over Europe. Cabinets of curiosities filled with relics, skulls, witch jars, and other freaky stuff. A few of these museums displayed what they claimed were authentic Iron Maidens. One in London, one in Nuremberg, one in Italy. All were slightly different. All were, conveniently, discovered at just the right time to shock Victorian audiences who loved a bit of horror with their tea. And it worked. The Iron Maiden became a cultural symbol, a punchline, a warning, and eventually a marketing tool. That's right. In the 20th century, a heavy metal band named Iron Maiden took the name, slapped the imagery on their albums, and helped immortalize the device all over again. Horror movies used it. Haunted houses built replicas. It became the go-to symbol for medieval cruelty. But none of that proves it was ever really used in the Middle Ages. And here's the part that messes with your head. Even if it wasn't real, people believed it. And they acted on those beliefs. They remembered it. They feared it. And in some ways, that makes it just as powerful as if it had been real. Because what's scarier? The pain you can see, or the pain you believe might happen? All right, let's slow it down a little. We've gone from ancient torture to medieval fear, to 18th century museum fraud, and now to pop culture. But there's more, way more. Let's talk about fear. Pain is bad, yeah, nobody likes pain. But fear is its own kind of monster. It eats you from the inside before anything touches your skin. And that's what makes the Iron Maiden so powerful, maybe even more than real torture tools. Because it didn't just hurt, it waited. Imagine you're in a cell. You've been there for days, maybe weeks. You've seen others dragged out screaming. You hear things, chains, screams, footsteps. You can smell burning hair one day. On another, it's just silence. The worst kind. Then they come for you. They take you down a hallway, past torches. You see that thing, that metal coffin standing in the corner. You don't even know what it is yet. You just know it's wrong. You've never seen it used. No one has. But rumors fly through prisons like flies on meat, and you've heard them. They put a man inside, closed it shut, and just left him there. The genius of the Iron Maiden wasn't the spikes. It was the anticipation, the imagination. It was the show. See, when it comes to torture, especially in the medieval and early modern eras, a lot of it wasn't about getting truth. It was about getting results, confessions, names, obedience, and more than anything, control. Let's be real. If someone wants you to admit to something you didn't do, they don't need to break every bone in your body. They just need to convince you that they will, and that it'll be worse than you can even picture. And the Iron Maiden, it looked like a death promise. People in power knew that. Kings, priests, judges. They knew fear was more useful than blood. That's why trials weren't always private. Executions weren't in secret. They were events, spectacles. People gathered in public squares to watch hangings, beheadings, burnings. Why? Because they weren't just punishment. They were warnings. Step out of line and this could be you. Let's back up to the 1400s for a second. Late medieval Europe. Heresy was a big deal. So was witchcraft, political dissent, any challenge to the crown or the church. That could get you labeled a traitor or a heretic, and that label could get you tortured. Sometimes it was official, like during the Inquisition, when the Catholic Church sent agents across Europe to investigate spiritual crimes. If you were suspected of holding the wrong beliefs, even if you didn't say anything out loud, you could be arrested, brought in, interrogated. Other times, it was just a matter of local power. A noble wanted your land, accuse you of sorcery. A town leader didn't like your attitude, accuse you of devil worship. And once that process started, good luck proving your innocence. Because the point wasn't proof, it was fear and torture devices. They were the props in that terrifying theatre. Now, here's the kicker. Most torture wasn't about killing people. In fact, they often tried not to kill you, at least not right away. Dead people don't talk. Dead people don't confess. Dead people don't scare the next guy. So the best devices were the ones that almost killed you. That made you wish for death. That broke your body and mind just enough to make you compliant, and then let you live, scarred, broken, a living warning. That's the part people forget. Torture wasn't always about punishment. It was about power. And no device embodied that idea better than the Iron Maiden. Let's talk about the actual design for a minute. The Iron Maiden, or more specifically, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, stood about 7 feet tall. It had 2 doors that swung open like a closet. Inside, dozens of metal spikes, carefully arranged so that they wouldn't pierce your heart or lungs right away. Instead, they'd stab you in the soft, painful, non-lethal places, under your arms, behind your knees, in your sides, sometimes in your genitals. The idea wasn't to bleed you out. It was to keep you alive, trapped, standing, pierced, and then close the doors, slowly, inch by inch, so each spike found its home. Now remember, this is assuming it was even used. Because here's the truth. We've never found any historical records showing the Iron Maiden was ever deployed in actual torture sessions. No trial records, no witness accounts, no autopsies, just stories, hearsay, maybe even straight up fabrication. And yet, even with that flimsy evidence, the Iron Maiden became iconic. Why? Because it taps into something primal. The fear of being buried alive, the fear of being trapped, the fear of pain, slow, creeping, claustrophobic pain. It's like combining a coffin, a bear trap, and a church confession booth all into one. Now let's get weirder. In the 1800s, Europeans became obsessed with their own brutal past. Historians, artists, and collectors started digging up, or straight up inventing, medieval horror stories. Gothic novels were huge. People wanted darkness, so they built museums filled with real torture devices. Some were authentic, many were not, but the visitors didn't care. They wanted the thrill, the shiver, the legend. The Iron Maiden fit that perfectly. It became a star attraction. Tour guides would show it off like this was used to punish heretics during the Inquisition. Visitors gasped, school kids fainted, and the myth grew. By the 20th century, the Iron Maiden was everywhere. Horror films, haunted houses, comic books, even cartoons. It became a cultural shortcut, an instant symbol for medieval evil. And then came the band. In 1975, a little group from London named Iron Maiden formed. They played heavy metal, loud, fast, aggressive. And their name, a direct reference to the torture device. Their mascot, Eddie, was a zombie-like figure who often appeared trapped, stabbed, or locked inside an Iron Maiden on album covers. And it worked. They blew up, sold millions of records, and cemented the device in pop culture forever. Now, here's the irony. The band never actually used an Iron Maiden on stage, but just the name, the imagery, the association. It was enough. People saw it and thought, brutality, power, rebellion. So here we are, centuries after the supposed invention of the Iron Maiden, still haunted by it, still fascinated, still unsure if it ever really happened. And maybe that's the point, because the Iron Maiden, real or fake, tells us something about ourselves, about what we fear, about what we believe, about how we use stories to justify cruelty or warn against it. It's a mirror made of metal and myth. And maybe that's more terrifying than any spike could ever be. So here's the real problem, the one that matters more than spikes and steel. What happens when we believe in the wrong version of history? What happens when we take a lie, a really scary, gruesome, dramatic lie, and we turn it into truth in people's minds? That's what the Iron Maiden does. That's what it's always done. It doesn't need to have existed. It just needs to be believed. And once you believe in something like that, something that's bigger than facts, bigger than truth, it can shape the way you see everything else. Think about it. How many times have you heard someone say the Middle Ages were just 1,000 years of torture and plague? That people back then were dirty, brutal, superstitious, backwards. That kings chopped heads for fun, and everyone believed the earth was flat. That image, that dark, bloody stereotype of the Dark Ages, comes from somewhere, and a huge part of it is fake. The term Dark Ages itself, that wasn't even used in the Middle Ages. It came after, during the Renaissance. That's when people started looking back and saying, wow, thank God we're not like those savages anymore. It was PR branding, a flex. We're smarter now. And the Iron Maiden, it became Exhibit A in that argument. It was used not just as a torture device, but as a symbol, a warning, a way to say, look how far we've come. But when you dig a little deeper, it turns out we might not have come that far at all. See, the problem with building myths around torture is that it lets modern people feel safe, like brutality is something we left behind, like it's them, not us. They used the Iron Maiden. We'd never do that. Really? Because if you think governments don't still use fear to control people, if you think interrogation techniques in the 21st century are all tea and polite questions, think again. Waterboarding, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, black sites. We've just made our Iron Maidens invisible. And that's the challenge, the uncomfortable truth. Torture isn't ancient. It isn't medieval. It's human. It's political. It's strategic. And it evolves. The Iron Maiden might be a myth, but the instinct behind it, that's real. That's still with us. And if we're not careful, we'll keep inventing new myths to justify it. Let's zoom out again. When people think about torture, they imagine evil men in dark rooms doing evil things. And yeah, that happened. But most of the time, it wasn't monsters who used these devices. It was regular people, clerks, judges, soldiers, priests. They weren't twisting mustaches and laughing maniacally. They were following orders, writing reports, keeping the system going. They told themselves, this is for the greater good. We need to extract information. This person is dangerous. We have no other choice. Sound familiar? That's the real danger of the Iron Maiden myth. It makes torture look like a relic, a past mistake, a thing of savages. But the truth is, it's the logic that survives, not just the tools. And the logic of torture has always been about three things: power, control, and fear. It's never really been about justice. Let's bring this home with a story. There's an account from 17th century Europe, not about the Iron Maiden, but about torture in general. A man was accused of stealing from the church. No one saw him do it. He denied it. But the evidence was thin, so the local authorities decided to interrogate him. The hard way. They tied him to the rack, stretched him, asked the same questions over and over. At first, he stayed quiet. Then, as the pain built, he confessed, said yes to everything, even things he couldn't have done. Why? Because his brain broke before his body did. Pain does that. Later, after his death, it came out that he was innocent. The real thief was someone else. But it didn't matter. The confession had already been filed, the body already buried, and the people who tortured him. They said, he confessed. What else were we supposed to do? The Iron Maiden, real or not, is just a more dramatic version of that logic. Pain equals truth. Fear equals justice. And that is the real lie. So what do we do with that? We keep going. In the next part of this story, we're going to look at how the myth of the Iron Maiden actually grew, how historians, museums, and yes, even governments helped build this image of medieval cruelty to serve their own agendas. It's not just about scaring people, it's about shaping minds. Get ready, this rabbit hole goes even deeper. Let's go back to the 19th century. It's the age of industrial revolutions, big hats, bigger moustaches, and even bigger egos. Europe is booming. Nations are expanding their empires. Cities are being electrified. Railroads are everywhere. And there's a growing obsession with something brand new, the past. And not just any past. A dark, mysterious, bloody, medieval past. Victorian England was wild for it. France too. Germany, even more. All across Europe, people started romanticizing the Middle Ages. Writers were churning out Gothic novels full of castles, ghosts, and executioners. Pain became fashionable. Horror was the new entertainment. So naturally, someone thought, you know what would sell a lot of museum tickets? A torture chamber. And boom, that's when the Iron Maiden made its grand stage debut. Forget facts, Forget historical accuracy. What people wanted was drama, atmosphere, shock value. So museum curators, many of them amateur historians or collectors, started buying, building, and sometimes just plain inventing medieval torture devices. They filled basements and side rooms with racks, wheels, iron boots, and yes, Iron Maidens. Nuremberg was one of the big players. Remember that city? That's where the Iron Maiden supposedly came from. In the early 1800s, they had a museum called the Germanisches National Museum, and in its collection, a towering Iron Maiden with spikes inside. They claimed it was used to punish counterfeiters in the 1500s, a gruesome relic of civic justice. The story spread fast. Newspapers printed it. Tour guides told it. People believed it. But historians now know the object was assembled using parts from multiple different periods. The body, probably a 16th century armor cabinet. The spikes, added in the 19th century. The doors, modified to make it more theatrical. And the story about the coin forger, almost certainly made up. But you know what? Nobody cared. People weren't going to museums to learn. They were going to feel, to be thrilled, to gasp, to look horror in the eye from a safe distance. And museums figured that out quick. They leaned into it. They gave the public what it wanted. And that's where things start to get messy. Because now, myths were becoming truth through repetition. Think about it. A kid sees the Iron Maiden in a museum. The plaque says it's real. The guide says it was used on criminals. The brochure calls it authentic. That kid grows up and tells the story to his kids. Maybe he writes a book. Maybe that book gets turned into a movie. And suddenly, boom, a fake thing becomes part of the collective memory. It's how legends are born. But it didn't stop with museums. Governments got in on it too. See, in times of political instability, fear is a useful tool. And history is one of the best weapons. During the early 20th century, as fascism rose in Europe, leaders started cherry-picking history to fit their narratives. They pointed to devices like the Iron Maiden as proof of barbaric enemies or the savagery of the past. It was always someone else's ancestors who used these things, never their own. The Nazis, for example, used images of medieval torture to stoke nationalism, not because they believed in the devices, but because they knew the power of symbolism. The Iron Maiden became shorthand for inhuman cruelty, backwardness, chaos, and fascist regimes positioned themselves as the opposite: strong, modern, disciplined. It's dark irony considering what came next. And then came Hollywood. By the mid-20th century, film directors, horror authors, and comic book artists were all borrowing from the same toolbox. And the Iron Maiden was the ultimate prop. It was big, it was scary, and it looked amazing on camera. You didn't have to explain anything. Just show it, close the doors with a dramatic clang, and the audience filled in the rest. It showed up in B-movies, in haunted houses, in cartoons and Halloween costumes. Sometimes it was used for laughs, other times for sheer terror. But always it brought the same message. This was medieval. This was evil. This was the past. And it's not hard to see why it stuck. Because let's be honest, the Iron Maiden is visually perfect. It's a monster in the shape of a wardrobe. And monsters make great stories. But here's the thing about stories. They shape what we believe. And what we believe shapes how we treat each other. When we paint the past as an endless parade of violence and torture, we trick ourselves into thinking we've escaped that we're better, more advanced, more civilized. But what if we're not? What if the only thing that's changed is the packaging? What if the real Iron Maiden isn't in a museum? What if it's built into systems, prisons, courts, politics, where suffering is just quiet enough not to make the news? The point is, myths are powerful, and when we build them out of pain, out of fear, we'd better be sure they serve the truth, because if not, they become something worse than a lie. They become history. And once that happens, it's hard to undo. In the next part of this story, we're going to the climax. We'll look at how the Iron Maiden came crashing back into the spotlight in the 20th and 21st centuries. How people finally started asking, wait, was this ever real? And how historians are trying to untangle fact from fiction, while still living in a world that desperately wants the fiction to be true. Buckle up, it's about to get wild. It all started to unravel with a simple question. Where's the proof? That question hit like a sledgehammer in the 20th century. First whispered by fringe scholars, then shouted by museum critics, and finally backed up by real historians armed with better tools, better archives, and a healthy dose of skepticism. And when they dug into the story of the Iron Maiden, guess what they found? Not a trail of blood, but a trail of lies. No records, no eyewitness accounts, no trial notes, no medieval blueprints, no clerical complaints, no execution orders, nothing. Just museum labels, a few 19th century essays, a handful of reprinted tales told after the fact, and even those were full of contradictions. Turns out, the so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, the one everyone points to, didn't show up until the late 1700s. And even then, it wasn't built from scratch. It was cobbled together using old furniture, scrap iron, and a wild imagination. And those spikes, they were added later, welded into place by someone who wanted the thing to look dangerous. Probably never meant to touch a single human body. It was a performance, a stage prop. Now, let's pause here, because this is where things get uncomfortable. You might think, okay, so what? It wasn't real. That's actually kind of a relief, right? And yeah, if you're just in it for the horror movie vibes, sure. But if you're trying to understand how myths shape history, this matters a lot. Because what the Iron Maiden teaches us isn't just that people lie, it's that we want them to. We want the villain, the monster, the medieval nightmare. We want the drama, the spectacle. Because if the past is full of horror, then the present must be better, cleaner, safer. But history doesn't work like that. The myth of the Iron Maiden lasted as long as it did because it served a purpose. It let museums sell tickets. It let governments shape stories. It let authors and artists tap into our deepest fears and package them neatly in steel. And the thing is, even after historians called it out, even after scholars said this never existed, the public didn't really care. People kept visiting, kept taking pictures, kept believing. That's the power of myth. It sticks. Even now you'll find Iron Maidens in medieval torture museums all over Europe. Some are honest and say, this was probably never used. Others still pretend. They'll dim the lights, add creepy music, and tell you that heretics were slowly crushed inside this iron tomb. And you'll believe it, because deep down, we want to believe in monsters. But here's the twist. Maybe the real monster isn't the machine. Maybe it's what the machine says about us. Because the Iron Maiden, real or fake, reveals something important. That we are drawn to cruelty when it's packaged as justice. That we are fascinated by pain, as long as it's happening to someone else. That we remember torture, not because it helps us grow, but because it entertains us. That's the climax of this story. Not a bloody execution, not a victim's final scream, but a quiet realization. We invented the Iron Maiden, not just as an object, but as an idea, because we needed it. We needed a villain we could point to. We needed a past we could feel superior to. We needed a nightmare that made us feel safe in our own beds. And once we had it, we refused to let it go, because admitting the truth that we built a fake torture device and believed in it for 200 years would mean admitting that maybe, just maybe, we're not as evolved as we like to think. So what now? Do we throw the Iron Maiden into the dustbin of history? Lock it up in the oops closet with other museum mistakes? Or do we keep it, not as a torture device, but as a warning? Not of what people used to do to each other, but of what people will believe when the story is just scary enough. So, what do we do with a lie that feels true? What do we do with a machine that was never real, but shaped the way millions of people imagine justice, pain, and the past? The Iron Maiden, in the end, isn't really about the Middle Ages. It's about us. It's about how we use fear to build stories, and how those stories shape everything, even when they're fake. It's about how we remember history, not based on facts, but on feelings, on images, on spikes and blood and the sound of steel. It's about how torture, even in its absence, still haunts our imagination. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all, because for centuries we believed in this device. We showed it to children. We wrote about it in textbooks. We pointed to it and said, this is what they did to people back then. But the truth is, it's what we did to people now. Not physically, maybe, but mentally, culturally, narratively. We turned suffering into a tourist attraction, turned pain into a prop, and worst of all, we used it to feel better about ourselves. We told ourselves, we've evolved. We don't do that anymore. But the real history of torture is quieter, slower, harder to spot. It's in the prisons where people are locked up indefinitely without trial. It's in the interrogations where people confess just to make the pain stop. It's in the systems that punish, not to reform, but to humiliate, to control, to make an example. And we justify it with stories, stories that start in the past, stories like the Iron Maiden. So maybe the lesson here isn't to throw the Iron Maiden out. Maybe the lesson is to keep it, not as a torture device, but as a mirror. Let it remind us how easy it is to believe what we want, how eager we are to trade facts for fear, and how powerful a story can be, even when it's built on nothing. Because sometimes, the things that never happened leave the deepest scars. And next time, someone points to the Iron Maiden and says, that's what the Middle Ages were like, ask them why they believe it. Ask them what makes that story so easy to accept. And then ask what stories we're building now. That's the real torture. It's not the spikes. It's the silence that follows them. If the Iron Maiden is the queen of medieval horror, then it has an entire court of disturbing cousins, each one more disturbing than the last. Or at least, that's what we're told. Because once you start pulling the thread on one torture myth, the whole thing starts to unravel. The Iron Maiden might be the flashiest, but it's not alone in the hall of historical shame. Let's start with the Pair of Anguish. If you've never heard of it, count yourself lucky. It's often described as a small metal device shaped like a bulb or pear, with petal-like segments that expand outward when a screw is turned. Supposedly, it was inserted into the mouth, or worse, into other body cavities, and then expanded to tear the victim apart from the inside. Sounds horrifying, right? Almost cartoonishly evil. That's the first red flag. Now here's the kicker. There's no solid proof this thing was ever actually used in torture. No trial records, no inventories of interrogation equipment, no detailed descriptions from the time period that say, we used this on someone and here's what happened. Just like with the Iron Maiden, most references come from much later, centuries later, and most of the surviving examples, suspiciously decorative. Some are engraved, polished, clean, like they were made for display, not destruction. Historians think the pear of anguish may have been a 17th or 18th century chastity symbol, or possibly a medical speculum that got a horrific backstory attached later. But just like with the Iron Maiden, the story stuck, because it's visceral. It taps into fears that are deeply physical, deeply personal, and people want to believe it existed, even if all signs say otherwise. Then there's the Judas cradle. Supposedly, this was a wooden or metal pyramid-shaped seat mounted on a pole. The accused would be tied up and lowered onto the point, naked, so it pierced them slowly. Hours of agony, maybe days. There are even illustrations, old ones, showing this device in use. But again, no actual documentation, no court records, no mention in medieval torture manuals, which did exist and were surprisingly detailed. The Judas cradle, like the pear, shows up after the fact, during the same time museums were building Iron Maidens and calling them real. It's very possible it was a scare prop, or maybe just a misunderstood form of punishment from a different era, misrepresented later for drama. And then there's the breast ripper, a jagged iron claw allegedly used to tear the breasts off women accused of adultery, heresy, or blasphemy. The object exists. You can find them in museums. But guess what? There's no definitive proof they were ever used. The shape is suggestive, sure, but historians argue it could just as easily be a blacksmith's tool or even a branding device used on livestock. But once again, people saw the shape. Someone wrote a chilling description, and boom, myth activated. Because here's the pattern: a terrifying object, a gruesome explanation. No real historical records to back it up. But we believe it, because fear is powerful, and so is suggestion. Let's be clear. We're not saying medieval Europe was soft and cuddly. There were very real torture devices. The rack, that's real. Whipping posts, real. The strappado, extremely real, and extremely painful. Devices like the heretic's fork, the thumbscrew, the pillory, all real, all used, all documented. But it's the ones that aren't real that tell us something even more disturbing, because they show how much horror we're willing to invent. It's like people weren't satisfied with how brutal the truth already was. They had to spice it up, make it worse, turn the Inquisition into something even darker, add more blood, more detail, more depravity. And once again, the public ate it up. That's the danger of spectacle. Once you turn pain into a performance, it stops being about truth. It becomes theater. And these devices, they're props, used not to hurt real people, but to control the story. Now think about what that means. Because if museums, writers, and even entire governments are willing to invent torture devices to scare you, what else are they willing to invent? What other stories are shaped not by evidence, but by effect? And what do those stories do to our understanding of justice? See, when we exaggerate the cruelty of the past, we risk minimizing the cruelty of the present. We say, well, at least we're not using the Judas cradle anymore. But then ignore the fact that solitary confinement exists, that people are still tortured, psychologically, emotionally, sometimes physically, in places all over the world today, We hide behind the fiction, because the fiction is scarier, but safer. It makes us feel like the monsters are all gone. But maybe they're not. Maybe they just wear suits now, or uniforms. Maybe they speak politely. Maybe they quote the law before they break someone. Maybe the Iron Maiden didn't die. Maybe it just went digital. Maybe it became policy. Let's shift focus. Not all torture happened in secret chambers. Not all screams were swallowed by stone walls. In fact, some of the most brutal moments in medieval justice happened in broad daylight, in front of crowds, with families eating snacks and kids sitting on their dad's shoulders. We're talking about public executions. But here's the twist. It wasn't just about killing someone. That was almost the least important part. Executions weren't the end of justice. They were the performance of it. Picture this. It's a summer morning. The town square is packed. There's a platform built just high enough for everyone to see. Flags are flying. Guards are lining the perimeter. People are selling food, playing music, gossiping. And then the accused is brought out. They're beaten, chained, bloodied. Maybe they've been tortured already. Maybe they're missing a finger or two. They're marched up the steps and put on display, not just to die, but to serve a purpose. And that purpose is to show the world. This is what happens when you disobey. The sentence is read. The crime is shouted out loud. Everyone hears it. Then the executioner, usually masked, usually a state employee, gets to work. Maybe it's a hanging, maybe a beheading, maybe a burning, maybe worse. And when it's done, the body doesn't just disappear. Sometimes it's left hanging for days. Sometimes the head is stuck on a spike. Sometimes the ashes are swept into the river, right where everyone can see. Why? Because pain is temporary, but fear is sticky. That's what public executions were really about. Not justice, but performance. Not punishment, but control. Not the death itself, but what it meant to everyone watching. And here's the part people forget. Most of the time, executions weren't chaotic. They were scripted. There were steps, rituals, speeches, orders. Even the condemned were expected to play a role. They had to confess, or pray, or beg forgiveness. If they didn't, the execution could be delayed, or worse, made more painful. Some were tortured before death, not to get information, but to humble them, to shame them, to strip away their dignity so the crowd could go home feeling morally superior. And that's the truly medieval part, the need to make suffering meaningful. Pain on its own, that's just biology, but pain with a moral story, that's power. And the church knew it. Religion played a massive role in how torture and execution were carried out. Heretics weren't just killed, they were purified by fire. Witches weren't just punished, they were symbols of chaos that had to be destroyed publicly. It wasn't just a person on trial, it was an idea, a behavior, a worldview. And the punishment? That was the exorcism. Now fast forward to the devices we talked about earlier. The Iron Maiden, the Pair of Anguish, the Judas Cradle. Even though many of them probably weren't used in real medieval torture, they reflect the same exact logic as these public executions. They're not just machines, they're messages. They say, we can hurt you in ways you can't even imagine. They say, we will not just end your life, we will define it. And that's what makes them dangerous. Not the steel, but the story. Because once the crowd believes the story, the punishment doesn't even have to be real. The threat is enough. People start policing themselves. They confess just to avoid suspicion. They obey not because they believe, but because they're afraid of what might happen if they don't. Sound familiar? You don't need a guillotine in the town square for that. Just give people a myth, a nightmare, a picture in their head that plays on repeat. The Iron Maiden is that picture. Even if no one ever died inside it, millions have imagined what it would feel like. Millions have told the story, passed it on, whispered it at sleepovers, described it in classrooms. Gasps, goosebumps. That's the real execution. It's not the spike. It's the idea that you could be next. Let's be real. You don't need metal spikes to break a person. You don't need chains, racks, or burning coals. You just need time, pressure, and silence. Torture, at its core, isn't really about pain. It's about control. And once you understand that, you realize that some of the most devastating torture methods in history didn't involve a single drop of blood. Let's start with isolation. Imagine you're in a cell, not a dramatic dungeon with rats and cobwebs, just a small silent room, no sound, no light, no voices, no idea how much time is passing. Minutes feel like hours. Hours feel like days. You start to doubt your own thoughts. You replay memories. You imagine things that aren't there. It doesn't take long before your brain turns on itself. Now add shame. You're stripped naked, not just of clothes, but of dignity. They mock you, call you names, make you crawl. You're not a person anymore. You're a thing. And the people doing it, they're calm, clean, orderly. They write notes, ask questions, offer food, then take it away. They're not monsters, they're professionals. And that's what makes it worse. This isn't rage, it's policy. Now let's talk about sleep, or rather, the lack of it. Sleep deprivation is one of the most common torture methods used around the world, ancient times to today. Why? Because it works. It breaks the brain faster than almost anything else. After 24 hours, you get irritable. After 48, you start slipping. Hallucinations, paranoia, emotional breakdowns. By day 3, people will say anything, confess to anything, beg for things that don't exist. And the worst part? There are no marks, no bruises, no blood, nothing you can photograph, nothing that leaves a scar you can point to. But inside, you're shredded. That's what real torture looks like. Not dramatic, spiked coffins. Just quiet, calculated dismantling of a person's will. And in many ways, that's more terrifying than any Iron Maiden. Because people can survive physical pain. Bones heal, wounds close. But the loss of identity, the collapse of trust in your own thoughts, that's harder to recover from. And this didn't start in Guantanamo Bay or CIA black sites. This goes back centuries. Even in medieval times, interrogators knew how to use sleep, shame, and fear to break someone down. They might keep a person in a cold, damp cell, deny them food, move them from place to place, prevent them from speaking, keep lights on at all hours, tell them their family had been arrested, even if it wasn't true. They weren't always looking for the truth. They were looking for control. Once you confessed, they won. Once you gave in, they were done. Even the Inquisition, which people associate with fire and racks, relied heavily on psychological manipulation. They'd pretend to be kind at first, offer you a chance to repent, offer to help you cleanse your soul. And if you refused, then came the torment. Not always physical. Sometimes it was just humiliation, public confession, forced marches, years of penance. And sometimes that was worse than death, because death is quick. Shame lingers. So why don't we see those methods in horror films? Why don't we see psychological torture devices in museums? Simple. They're not visual. They don't make you gasp, they make you uncomfortable. And we don't like to feel uncomfortable about the present. We'd rather distance ourselves. We want the evil to be far away, far in the past. We want iron maidens, not paperwork. We want chains and spikes, not solitary confinement logs and silent rooms. But that's the trap. That's what the myth lets us do. It lets us believe torture is only real when it's theatrical, bloody, ancient. When in reality, the most dangerous torture is the kind no one sees. And that should scare us more than any medieval machine ever could. Let's talk about something that gets glossed over in most horror stories. Paperwork. Yeah, we all love to imagine medieval justice as wild and chaotic. Men in hoods swinging axes, dungeons full of blood, executioners deciding fates with a sneer and a nod. But the truth, torture was often bureaucratic. It wasn't just chaos. It was codified, regulated, organized. You'd be shocked how many countries had official legal systems for how, when, and why someone could be tortured. Let's rewind to the 13th century, when things started getting real specific. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued a papal bull called Ad Extirpanda. Catchy name, huh? This little document gave official church approval for the use of torture during the Inquisition, but only under certain conditions. It said torture could be used on heretics, but it had to be done without killing or maiming the accused. Basically, make them suffer, but, gently. This was the beginning of the church legalizing suffering, not just allowing it, structuring it, and governments followed suit. In civil law, especially across much of continental Europe, torture was actually written into criminal codes. A judge could authorize torture, but only after a certain amount of evidence had been collected. They called it the half-proof rule. If there was almost enough evidence to convict someone, like testimony from 2 witnesses, or 1 witness and some circumstantial stuff, they could order torture to try to force a confession. No conviction yet, just a little pain to help the truth come out. And once a confession came, boom, that was your full proof. See the problem? You create a system where the only way to win is to confess. And the only way to confess is through suffering. And then you call it justice. It's like making someone solve a riddle while being punched in the face, and then punishing them for getting the answer wrong. And it wasn't just in Europe. Similar logic appeared all over the world. Different empires, different laws, same outcome. In many Islamic legal traditions during the medieval period, physical torture was less common, but psychological pressure, confinement, and shaming tactics were widely used. The Ottomans used public spectacle, beatings, parades, humiliation. Not because it was fun, but because it worked. In Imperial China, confession was everything, and while some dynasties officially banned torture, others embraced it. Bamboo canes, pressurized kneeling, repeated beatings. Devices were used, but with rules. There were even bureaucratic forms to fill out. Name, date, method of torture, confession obtained. Yes or no. Again, paperwork. And the scariest part? They believed they were being ethical. They told themselves, we're not barbarians. We have rules. We don't just beat people. We beat people for a reason. Sound familiar? Because today, we still hear that logic. We don't torture. We enhance interrogation. We're just getting the truth. It's legal under the right conditions. Those phrases, they're the modern version of papal bulls and royal edicts, just dressed up in nicer fonts. The point is, systems of torture, ancient or modern, always come with excuses. They never call themselves evil. They call themselves necessary, efficient, regulated. And when we believe that, that's when the real damage happens. Because cruelty dressed in law feels righteous. It feels earned. And the people carrying it out, they don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as enforcers, protectors, heroes. That's the chilling truth of the Iron Maiden. And every fake device like it. They aren't just stories. They're symbols of a mindset. One that says, as long as we write the rules, we can hurt whoever we want. So where does that leave us? What's the final word on the Iron Maiden? Was it real? Probably not. Was it used? Almost definitely not. But was it powerful? Absolutely. Because real or not, the Iron Maiden became a way for us to talk about pain, power, fear, and control. It became the monster in the closet of our historical imagination. A symbol of what happens when we trade truth for drama and justice for revenge. And maybe the scariest thing of all is that we still haven't learned the lesson. Here's a strange fact. The Iron Maiden, a device most people associate with the Dark Ages, was born during the Age of Enlightenment, a time when reason, science, and individual rights were supposed to be replacing superstition, fear, and monarchy. Funny how that works. Let's rewind to the 1700s. Europe is changing fast. Scientific discoveries are shaking the foundations of religion. Philosophers are writing essays about liberty, equality, and the nature of the soul. Revolutions are brewing. Monarchs are scared. And average people are hungry, not just for bread, but for stories. This is when pain becomes entertainment. Gothic horror starts gaining ground, not just as a literary genre, but as a national obsession. Writers like Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, and Matthew Lewis start telling tales of haunted castles, cursed bloodlines, and tortured souls trapped in ancient stone. The Middle Ages, long buried beneath classical nostalgia, suddenly become sexy, spooky, and profitable. And here's the trick. In most of these stories, torture plays a central role. But not just any torture, medieval torture. Because in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Middle Ages became the scapegoat of modern cruelty. Whenever a society needed to show how civilized it had become, it painted the past as barbaric, and so the Iron Maiden was invented, not as a tool of the Inquisition, but as a character in a morality play, a dark symbol of how far we had come. Museums were in on it, writers were in on it, historians too, not necessarily out of malice, but because the myth worked. People wanted to believe that history was filled with monsters, that they had risen out of that darkness. And the Iron Maiden, it was the perfect monster. Cold, silent, inescapable. Even the name was poetic. You can almost hear the whispers. This was real. Can you believe how savage they were? But the unspoken follow-up is always, aren't we better now? That's the story we were sold. That's the story we bought. But in truth, the Iron Maiden was never about medieval cruelty. It was about modern superiority. And superiority, that's always a dangerous drug. It lets people rewrite history, hide their own sins, look down their noses at other nations, cultures, or eras, all while ignoring the horrors they're still committing. So no, the Iron Maiden didn't come from a medieval torture chamber. It came from a printing press, from the minds of playwrights, poets, curators, and collectors. From the same Enlightenment thinkers who said, let's reason our way out of tyranny while colonizing the globe, enslaving millions, and inventing myths to justify it all. You want a real torture device? Try ideology. It cuts deeper than iron ever could,